Yeah.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
You can do better than that, but okay. My name's Jack. Welcome to Freedom Bookshop. Contrary to popular belief, we haven't been in this building since the late 19th century. I had to break it to Erica earlier, and I'm already feeling like a bastard. Thanks for coming. We have been here since the mid-60s. The press itself was founded in 1886 under the leadership, always seems like the wrong word, Charlotte Wilson and Peter Kropotkin. Anyway, that's not why we're here tonight. We are here to hear from Erica. Pisces sun sign, is that what you said?
Well, Pisces is Mars or something dangerous.
Right, okay. And Grand Magus of the Kitchen Garden.
Yeah. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, everybody. It's nice to know that all my hard work is appreciated by some people. Okay. And maybe if I stand up too, my voice will carry farther. I'll try that. If I get tired, I'll sit down. This way people can see me better, too. I can see you guys. Yeah, I got involved myself in anarchist activism and politics about 20 years ago. That makes me feel old when I say that, but it's about that now. It was like, the turn of the millennium. I was really into it and enthusiastic for a few years until I started to be a bit, I started to get frustrated with some of the contradictions and hypocrisies among some of my anarchist comrades, right, as we all do after a certain amount of time. The gloss wears off. In my case, the thing that frustrated me the most was actually like class elitism among the university student anarchists and stuff, and that's what my larger dissertation is about. This book is kind of a chapter 3 of my full PhD dissertation, which is about how middle-class anarchists fuck up intersectionality. And what I mostly focus on in this book and tonight are contradictions around like race and gender and anarchist politics. And I'll start with like an example that kind of shows how anarchists, fall short sometimes. I'll tell a story of how these activists in Montreal, this is about 2006-07 now, we organized a speaking tour of some indigenous activists from Oaxaca, Mexico to come up and do a tour about the struggles of their region. And as the events go on, there's two of them. There's a man and there's a woman. The man is talking about, union movements and political repression and political prisoners and state and speaking in and everyone loved it. They're like, he's talking about how his indigenous villages never voted in a political party. It's always rejected the politics of the state. Magdalena, when she spoke, when she went up, she talked about her work as going around speaking with women of the region, helping them become familiar with and resist and avoid the sterilization programs that the government tries to apply to indigenous women in that area. And when she spoke about the need to maintain harmonies among all of God's creation and stuff. And so, and people didn't respond to her very well. No one asked her questions after. As the events went on, she spoke less and less. By the end of the tour, she was just introducing Juan in in some kind of ritualized greeting in her indigenous language, like lending a touch of authenticity to the whole thing, and then Juan would talk and she would say goodbye, and it was really kind of upsetting to watch how that happened. And I wrote a paper about it, like my first published paper after that, being like, what is going on here? Anarchists say they want to take lead from the indigenous people in the global south till they actually start speaking, and then actually they should learn from the anarchists. And is it really that Magdalena needs to be politicized? Do the anarchists really have better knowledge than her? Or how do we build these kind of coalition, horizontal solidarity in this situation? And I talked about how that there was two public and private dichotomies that made it difficult for her listeners to understand her as political, right? It was the fact that she spoke in a religious language, and it was the fact that she talked about her work with women's reproductive health. It was both of those things might have worked against her a little bit, but both together really made it difficult for people to see how she was a political agent. And I published that, and then I got feedback on it. The feedback was like, oh yes, it's true, we should try harder to respect indigenous identity. And I was like, this is not about indigenous, that is not about pretending, nodding and smiling politely and being nice to the person, but secretly thinking that they're wrong that's not actually really very anti-racist, and you're just being polite. And so I thought I got to go show people that, like, anarchism has its own cosmology. There's a whole bunch of theological and cosmological precepts that, like, inform anarchist politics, and that's not a bad thing or whatever. It's just all politics has cosmological foundations, and to think that we have no cosmology but they have cosmology, or we're rational and they're not rational, and that whole rubric comes from the colonial encounter. And so I'm like, okay, in order to tell the story, I actually got to go back. I got to go back and show that, like, how anarchism, comes from history, how it's developed in a certain cultural moment. Like, a lot of standard histories of anarchism will talk about peasant movements, Christian millenarian movements, all these things as like precursors to anarchism. And then you've got, bam, modernity and anarchism. Well, what happened in between there and there? And so I go to the library, I'm like reading about, the overlap between anarchist thinkers and practitioners of, like, early socialist politics, and the social spheres in which they moved, and the things they're interested in, and find that, in order to talk about this, I need to talk about all these revolutionary fraternities. I need to talk about revolutionary brotherhoods, and I need to talk about these reading societies and these new masculine public spheres that are, like, emerging in this modern European situation. And I need to talk about the Illuminati, and I need to talk about Freemasons, and I'm like, I don't want to talk about that. Actually, that wasn't my fucking project at all. But around the same time, something happened that made me think, oh no, I got to do this. And that was that I leave after one of our collective meetings one day. It was a Zapatista Solidarity Collective. This is also about 2007. It was the same collective that organized the speaking tour that I just mentioned. Afterwards, one of the guys says, oh, we got to do better, right? We organize film screenings and fundraisers and all that, but the people in power, they're really organized. They're really organized. And he's speaking in this way where I'm like, what is he talking about? Like, he seemed like he was talking about something more than the obvious fact that, the governments have armies and we don't. And he's like, yeah, they're organized. And so what do you mean? And then him and a few others start talking about, the banking system and the Federal Reserve and the Bilderberg Group and the Freemasons and the Knights Templar and the whole thing. And I was like, wow, like, I didn't really know the story when I heard it. It was kind of like, I heard bits and pieces. I heard some things about Freemasons, but I hadn't heard this historical narrative before. And I was kind of taken in by it too. I was like, I don't know, maybe, like, I don't know. And then one of the guys says something about how all these guys in these secret, powerful groups are Jewish. And I was like, oh, that rings a bell. That's not cool. This is where we're going with this. Okay, and I wasn't expecting it. We're like in an anti-racist Zapatista Solidarity Collective. I'm like, what the fuck? Okay. So we start engaging about it. We have a talk. I say something like, maybe there are secret ritual fraternities decorating the capitalist class, but, like, is it really reasonable to think that they're all of the same religion? Like, maybe they're all capitalists, right? Maybe they're all Christian and Jewish and whatever, all kinds of stuff. And the conversation doesn't end that evening, right? He recommends me some reading and tells me to watch some stuff on YouTube, which has just been born. This is like 2006, right? So, and I'm like, okay. And I go away and I read the book he recommends, which is The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and I watch the YouTube videos, and I watch all the YouTube videos. And we continue to talk about it over the course of the year, okay? Like, and the punchline here is that the two guys that were into the idea of the Jewish conspiracy, through the dialoguing around it over the course of the year, actually moved away from that position. That was important, I thought, and I thought, because I was tuned in then to, like, what was going on, and I knew what was going on YouTube, and I was sort of, like, clued in to this cultural phenomenon of the conspiracy theories in the YouTube. I kept watching it, and I kept realizing more and more people were really into this, and I thought it's important to write something about it, maybe to hopefully try and disinform some of this history about the left and the secret societies, given how much hype there is about it. Maybe at a different moment, in a different collective, in a different year, that guy saying that, we might have just, like, thrown him out of the collect, but, like, that's not what we did. We argued with him, and we managed to change his mind, and I thought that was cool. So I wrote this book. Now, a lot of the people that need to read the book will probably not read the book, but that's why I want to make YouTube videos. But anyways, I'm working up to it. That's kind of the intro of how why I came to do the book and what the book aims to do. It kind of tries to do two things at once. It tries to, my original point, right, was like, let's talk about what is the cosmology of anarchism, what is the gender of anarchism, how is anarchism a cultural product that's developed at a certain moment in time and has baggage for those reasons, and talk about that in terms of how to do anti-colonial solidarity work with people who have religious inclinations, including but not exclusively indigenous people, and then at the same time, address some of these questions about conspiracy and secret societies that's really hyped in pop culture. I'm going to, at this point, maybe just go into some of the historical material. I'm going to go through a bit about what's in the book in terms of the 19th century. In your standard history of social movements, anarchist history of social movements, they'll often start with things like Anabaptists, ranters, diggers, these sort of early spontaneous, millenarian, chiliastic social movements, peasant movements. And then at some point you have organized social movements with programs for change. So instead of a spontaneous movement that grows up surrounding a charismatic figure who whips everyone into a frenzy, you have organizations with membership and rules and plans and things, right? And these are including, and this is including Christian movements, like heretic movements, like just after the Crusade. And then what happened there? There's a lot of things that happened there. There's many, many factors. It's not that simple. But one thing that I talk about is how a lot of mystical treatises were rediscovered during the Renaissance, okay, that were not Christian at all. There was Kabbalah, there was Neoplatonic revival, Platonism, there was algebra, the Pythagorean theorem. All of these things were rediscovered. And the Hermetic doctrine was also rediscovered during this time, the Hermetica. Has anyone heard of the Hermetica? Who knows the Hermetica? Oh, okay, so, all right. Now, these were a series of texts that were written in the 1st or 2nd centuries AD, but during the Renaissance they were held to be much older. They were understood to be reporting the original ancient secret, original knowledge of ancient Egypt, which came before the Greeks, which informed the Greeks. So the translator that was working on Plato at the time, when the Hermetic text came in, they're like, fuck Plato, drop that guy, this is the real thing, drop this. Everyone thought this was the real, true, unadulterated original knowledge. And the Hermetic doctrine has a variety of features which you'll actually recognize. Those of you that don't know the Hermetica, this will be familiar because it comes up in almost all New Age stuff, okay? In the Hermetic doctrine, the cosmic time is characterized by a pulsation of emanation and return, okay? Where the universe kind of unfolds from an original unity into ever more complexity by splitting into twos and threes and so forth. And the idea is that there will also be a regeneration of unity, that at some point there'll be a oneness that is found again, and that humanity, or man, coming to, of course, man coming to consciousness of his role, in the regeneration of cosmic unity is an important step in the regeneration of this unity itself. We have to help this come to pass. As the complexity unfolds, there's the idea of correspondences and energy and light and secret correspondences that unify the levels for those that are aware of them. Man is a microcosm of the universe, and so we can learn about the universe from learning about ourselves. As above, so below. Although things seem different, there is an underlying unity, so in duration everything remains related, all is one. You get the idea, right? And so in this worldview, God and creation become the same, and man becomes divine and has a defined role, and man is allowed to act on the universe. Instead of it being sacrilegious. There's like a whole Christian idea of like that, you're not allowed to act on the world. But here you're entitled and empowered to act on the world. And not only that, but we've got some kind of, divine role in making the world a better place and creating kind of a secularized, heaven on earth in the here and now through building it, through agency, through knowledge. And so the Hermetica lends itself to a variety of projects, right? It's adaptable to a variety of things. The Hermetica arrives with a really neat metaphysical geometry, right? And it arrives at the same time as things like algebra and the Pythagorean theorem that actually allow people to build things in ways never before imagined. So vaulted cathedrals, calculus, mathematics is a very powerful form of magic. It arrives alongside this metaphysics that is also very mathematical, and the whole thing lends itself to a massive investment in mathematical forms and understanding, which becomes like the real basic truth and language of the universe, and develops science basically on this basis. And that is talked about quite a bit, like in in histories of the Enlightenment these days. That's kind of well known, thanks to Francis Yates. But what isn't talked about as much is how the Hermetica has helped inspire new leveling movements from below. Okay, specifically here, the key example being Freemasonry. Okay, Freemasons, they dress themselves up like Egyptians. It's all about Egypt. It's all about ancient knowledge. It's all about building, the metaphor of building a new society, and importantly, the idea that man tends toward perfection, and it's a matter of helping this along through it's a mixture of inbuilt cosmic fate and will and agency that's going to create this new perfect world that men themselves are going to build. So it's not like heaven on earth being graced by some kind of something falling from the sky. It's that we're going to build it. So it's a new kind of scientific Christian heaven on earth. Pantheism is a word that starts being used at this time. Pantheism being God is inside us and all around us. The fact that we now are able or entitled to consider ourselves as divine agents means we can act. The Freemasons, they were anti-clerical, critical of the church and the monarchy, but also dressed up in Egyptian and Druidic thing and created rituals, and it was all about this sort of pantheistic spirituality. These are all masculine public spheres, right? Here we're getting back to the question of gender. This is kind of what social movements look like after the witch hunts, right? I mean, you have the women's status and participation in these other early modern social and Christian peasant movements that we talked about was always ambiguous. It's not necessarily women were in charge, but women were there. In these places, women are not actually present. These discussions are happening in specifically masculine spheres, where it's men that have access to the ancient original secret magic wisdom, and it's them that's going to illuminate the way. The Masons are both liberal and radical. Okay, yes, so some people involved, they are just using this fraternity as a way to consolidate their already existing social power, okay? Some people that were involved were actually looking to dismantle hierarchies in society in a more profound way. Both things were happening at once. There's a sign of tension between the discourse of Freemasonry, meeting upon the level, building a new egalitarian society, but women aren't allowed in, Jews aren't allowed in, workers aren't allowed in, and then as things unfold, people bring these contradictions to light. What are we going to do about it? And little, things start happening. Okay, we'll reduce the literacy requirement, or we won't make people pay to be in anymore. They never let the women in, but they did start letting more workers in, and there was this. In any case, there was always this tension, right, between the people that were kind of like your bourgeois liberal revolutionaries, right, and people who were to become more socialist, radical revolutionaries, and one of the people who joined Masonic Lodge and was discontented or not satisfied with the level of critique that he found within was Adam Weishaupt, who was the founder of the Illuminati in 1776, founded this group. He was a professor from Bavaria. He started a group with 5 students. It was like a reading society. They mostly just talked about things that are quite commonplace now, but were very provocative at the time, like the importance of science versus religion, and they did also talk about cosmic regeneration, and Weishaupt's writings are like a mix of like the Pythagorean mystery schools and Eleusinian mysteries and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and it's all mixed together. And he's going to unearth this secret ancient magical wisdom and create a new egalitarian sort of society. It becomes quite big. It ends up including people like Mozart and Herder and Goethe and all these famous 19th century or 18th century guys. And there's like 3 levels. It's kind of modeled after the Masonic structure in the sense that there's levels and it's pyramid shaped and stuff. And at some point they do go back to the lodges to try and get more people involved, right? Like these days, if you're trying to get more people involved in your radical social movement, you might go. Where might you go, right? At the time, the place where you would be most likely to find people who would listen to you and maybe join your crew would be in Masonic lodges. So they'd go there and they'd get more friends. At some point, one of the members is pissed off, probably for good reason, God knows why, whatever, you know how collectors are, and he goes and tells on his employer. And the Duchess of Bavaria ends up finding out and freaks out and feels like this group its purpose is to like annex Bavaria to Prussia, and a whole repressive campaign begins, and the Illuminati are chased out. And this is the first time you actually hear the idea that all Freemasons are under the control of the Illuminati. But this was the government worried about the Freemasons being radicalized by the Illuminati. At this point, the members go into hiding or exile. At around the same time, the French Revolution is happening. After the French Revolution, all the monarchies in Europe, they're very freaked out, obviously. They don't want the same thing to happen. And you have the first Interpol kind of scenario. You have the first cooperation among different heads of state monarchs in Europe where they get together, the Congress of Vienna in 1814, and they decide to cooperate among themselves to prevent revolutionary inroads in Europe. So they're going to extradite prisoners and stop the dissemination of literature and across borders and stuff like that. And so at this time, anyone who had been part of the Illuminati or any other similar group goes into hiding. It's a period of repression. And you do see at this time other groups starting up that are kind of mimic the Illuminati or the Masons in structure and form. They're pyramid-shaped organizations that have ritual titles and stuff. And it's partly because it's practical, right? First of all, it's partly because they're descending from the same group, but it's not always that they're descending. One group a guy goes into hiding and starts up a new group somewhere else. Some of it's like that, but some of it's just that people are copying. This huge scare that the government created around this group had the effect of being inspiring people to try it, maybe a little bit, right? They created a whole aura of fear around this and the danger and the possible dangers of these secret societies, and so people were like, well, let's start some, and let's do this then, and so it was partly practical, right? The way that people organized in this way, if you don't know everyone else in the organization, then if you get caught and tortured, you can't give up your comrades, right? Has anyone seen the movie The Battle of Algiers?
We're actually screening it in 3 weeks if you haven't seen it. So,
watch it. It's a good movie. Yeah, it's not. They're not pyramid shaped, but there's a cell structure in the revolutionary in Algeria where not everyone knows who everyone else involved. Anyway, it's a practical tactic. So partly people are organizing these pyramid shaped groups because it's practical. Partly they're doing it though because there's a symbolic strength to it. The idea, the self-understanding of the people involved, connecting themselves in their own eyes and understanding and in the eyes of others with a long lineage of secret, important, magical knowledge that's going to help them succeed, makes the people feel filled with a sense of right and importance and lends power to what they're doing. So both things are happening. Yeah, so Bakunin was someone, moving forward. who also talked about how like revolution was imminent in the people, but illuminated men were necessary to guide them in the right direction. Speaking of himself, of course, right? And Bakunin's, he was also a Freemason. He also tried the tactic of getting comrades that way. It's very similar to what Weishaupt was doing, except that Bakunin was wanting to infiltrate the IWA to wrest it from authoritarian socialist control, whereas Weishaupt was looking to infiltrate Masonic lodges to wrest them from liberals' control. So in a way what they were doing was very different, but in a way their tactic was actually a bit similar. And they're working in a tradition. The International Working Men's Association was founded, the founding meeting was in the Freemasons' Tavern. There was exiled Republican Socialist Freemasons. If it wasn't for the support of the Freemasons, the IWA would not necessarily have gained the strength that it did at the time. And the circle A and the star and a lot of these symbols that we associate with socialism and anarchism date back to this period. The star hosts an endless charge of meanings going back to Pythagorean times. It was used by the second grade of Masons to it was used by the Masons to symbolize the second grade of membership of comrade or compañero. And then it was adopted by the IWA and socialists at that time from the second grade of the Freemasons. The circle A, I actually put a thingy in the book here to show you. The early versions of the circle A are clearly made with the set square and plumb line of Masonic iconography. I'll pass it around, okay? Don't hold it. That's the Spanish locale of the IWA. And anarchists these days, we don't necessarily know this history, and it's not that we have to, but it is interesting. We don't know this history necessarily. Like May Day, we often think that May Day marches go back to the massacre in Haymarket. But why was there a march in Haymarket on May Day in the first place? May Day was already an important day. The Illuminati was founded on May Day. May Day was a very important day for hundreds of years, and we don't know this. But at the time in the 19th century, a lot of these associations were actually well known to the people involved, and they lent power to what people were doing. They contextualized things in history in a way that made things meaningful and sensible to the people involved. And the main people that were really unhappy with the kind of overlap of pantheistic spirituality and ritualism and so forth, and socialist politics were Marx and Engels, who were into their very scientific socialism. But even Marx's theory of history, it doesn't actually depart that much from the whole New Age imagination. An era of communism will come about that will be perfect, after a mixture of inbuilt cosmic fate and agency and will. And there's a whole chapter in the book about Hegel and the dialectic and how Hegel was a Hermetic theorist and stuff, but I'll leave that for the Hegel nerds and people that really want to learn about Marx and Hegel and Hermetica and all that. But it's there if you want it. Yes, but the point is, whether Marx liked it or not, right? The people that first translated the Communist Manifesto was the American Association of Spiritualists. Not first translated it in America, I should say. But it probably really pissed off Marx. But that's how it was, right? And I think I'm gonna give some more examples. Just gonna whip through some other quick examples which are dealt with, in more detail in the book, of New Age connections with 19th century socialism and anarchism. You've got Charles Fourier, who's often mentioned in histories of anarchism. He had this idea of a law of passional attraction, which suggested that there was a series of correspondences and balances in nature that could be discerned and then applied to human society, which is clearly a kind of hermetically influenced worldview. There was a lot of anarchists that were into the theosophy of Elena Pavlova Blavatsky, who had a whole... anyone know Blavatsky?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. She had a whole worldview. It was wild, but it involved things like, cosmic root races, finding cosmic union, and had a lot. And I talk in the book about Darwinian theories of evolution, Blavatsky, theosophical ideas of evolution and revolution, how those ideas developed in tandem. talk about Tolstoy, who admired Fedorov, who thought that the task of humanity was to resurrect the forefathers from like cosmic dust in the atmosphere, and Rhoda Kanati, who was the first proselytizer of anarchism in Mexico, who like distributed pamphlets called Neo-Pantheismo, and was Sandino, who was a revolutionary in the early 20th century in Nicaragua, who the later Sandinistas in the 70s and 80s were named after. He was really into theosophy and Zoroastrianism and Hinduism, and flew like a 7-striped rainbow flag full of like, different religious symbols, and was kicked out of the Third International as a consequence because Stalin was really not into that. We don't necessarily know that about him, but there's all these stories. And all these complex scenarios of colonial encounter, they really deserve more detail than I'm giving them now, and even than I give them in the book. But I whip through these examples to give an idea, suggesting that the sort of cosmological fusion and syncretism that always underlied and informed anarchist politics from the beginning just keeps going, and maybe just finds its latest expression in present-day anarchists' kind of selective fascination with indigenous cosmologies and cultures, for better or for worse, right? Yeah, and I'm going to stop with the history there. That's like just whipping through the history. The idea is just that, the basic point, right, is just that socialism and anarchism, and we can distinguish those, later if we like, obviously, but and occultism and New Age spirituality kind of developed and coexisted in a complementary fashion through a lot of the 19th century, and that this is downplayed or rewritten in mainstream histories of the left. Just as like Newton's dabbling in alchemy and magic is sort of tends to be downplayed in histories of the Enlightenment. So you have like Charles Fourier's law of passional attraction rewritten as a society in which people are allowed to engage in free play of passions. I invited Peter Marshall, but he's not here, is he? Because that was him anyway. But, the connection with fascism is highlighted. Like, if ever you talk about occultism or the New Age, what we hear about is like how fascists are doing it, and that is absolutely true. The fascists picked up all this stuff and were inspired by it. But so it's not that occult spirituality, the occult revival, New Age spirituality, or all this necessarily leads to a kind of radical revolutionary politics. It doesn't necessarily lead there at all. Magic, it can go in either direction. When approached with people with a lust for power, magic can be used to justify and advance those aspirations. But if it was not, for the influx of so much knowledge charged as ancient magical wisdom at the time that helped triangulate popular religion, modern materialism, and social discontent in new ways, we might not have seen anarchism and socialism as we know them. So then the takeaway here, and coming back to the present day, and there's 2 chapters at the end that kind of bring us back to the present, and then kind of reflect on why is this relevant to think about now. And I'll just whip through that quickly. I don't want to tell you everything because I want you to buy the book, but give you some idea, So one of the points is, returning to the idea of atheism and how that complicates questions of anti-colonial solidarity with all these diverse movements in the world that we hope to work together with, and how the question is not just one of respecting identity. I talk about how, the question of spirituality, religion, in terms of the debates around cultural appropriation, which is a big important topic these days in social movements. And it makes sense that, for example, people are critical of cultural appropriation right now because in this particular historical moment, it's possible for people with dominant identities and status to valorize themselves and authenticate themselves by donning accoutrements of people that they structurally oppress, and so it makes sense to talk about that and why that is and how it's fucked up. But we also lose something when we reduce culture to property, especially religion or a question of spirituality, because what we're doing when we say that cosmology is only are appropriate to specific preordained identities, we're basically saying they're false, because we're saying they're not applying across the cosmos whatsoever, and they only apply to certain people. And so we kind of reduce all non-Western cosmology to like cultural accoutrements in a marketplace as big as the universe. And that's kind of fucked up and colonial and racist too. So how do you navigate that? I don't have the answer, but it's an important dilemma to think about, you know. In terms of gender, you know, we can say anarchism, it's perfectly fine for anarchists today to aspire to be against all forms of domination. I think that's good. I think we should do that. But just saying it doesn't necessarily make it so. We have to work at that, because the revolutionary person, what we imagine the revolutionary person to be, sound like, do, is constructed against a variety of exclusions at the outset. You know, like being recognized, like socially recognized as an anarchist is not just about, you know, it's often about like demonstrating a certain amount of cultural capital, you know, like it tends to be a bunch of masculine cultural capital, like knowing what Malatesta said on a certain day, or like what Kropotkin wrote, or, you know, and subscribing to a certain kind of analysis and model of power, wherein like men's oppression by the state becomes a prototype for all power. Which, you know, anarchism is a cultural product. It's invented by certain people at certain times, so it's got baggage, you know. It doesn't mean that it can't be, it doesn't mean that we throw it out, but it means we have to think carefully about what we mean, you know, and how to make it true that anarchism would be really against all forms of domination and not always be like coming from the vantage point of the man concerned about the state. You know, and it is, I don't want to force an analogy by being like, it's a boys' club. It's like the same as like these initiatic societies of the 19th century. Like, you know, I don't know, push my luck here, but there are some hidden correspondences that are worth thinking about. Yeah, the idea of the vanguard. There's this whole thing, you know, anarchists, we're not vanguardists. Marxists, they're vanguardists. We're not vanguardists. Okay. Unless you think of the vanguard as a political party, then I don't see how anarchists aren't vanguardists. Like anarchists, we've always imagined ourselves as, you know, to have particular insight that we're looking to share with people, to move things along and to change the world. And that's not a bad thing, but these days it tends to be dissimulated in a lot of discourse of solidarity. Like, I'm just taking lead from these guys who are more oppressed than me, and that's the only reason I'm doing what I'm doing. But it's a bit disingenuous. We don't talk about consciousness raising because it sounds too Marxist, but there's like all these people having, you know, anti-oppression workshops and other things which are basically consciousness raising activities, which are fine, but just I think it's important to own what we're doing sometimes. Anarchism does have a project. There's a whole discussion about sovereignty and gender in there, which is a bit detailed and technical. I won't get into the whole thing, but staying with gender, like, oh yeah, I complain about Agamben. Anyway. Yeah, I swear to God, no. Like, he proceeds as if you can like equate human being and like male citizen of Rome or France, you know. It's like, and if you follow indigenous women's writing and words on sovereignty, you learn something that you fail to notice if you read people like Agamben and Schmidt and so forth, which is that, you know, women and children were never like subsumed by the sovereign. You know, it's male citizens that are subsumed by the sovereign, because women and children are subsumed by the male head of household, who is then subsumed by the sovereign. And this is important because that whole displacement in sovereignty is carried forward and replicated in the anarchist idea of autonomy. The autonomy is sovereignty of the person. It's like the idea of autonomy only makes sense and it happens in dialectic with the idea of sovereignty. It's kind of like taking a state discourse and applying it to the person. So it's trying to be against the state, but actually it's replicating the state's logic. And just as the state considers itself benevolent to those, you know, that it subsumes, could not live without, you know, its citizens, so does, you know, the anarchist sort of feel himself benevolent to the women and children that he subsumes and cannot live without, who clean up all his shit or whatever, right? There's a bit of a parallel there that's good to think about. Okay, I'm going to just close now. I'm going to say a few things about secret societies and the whole thing about conspiracy theory before I finish. Okay, so anyone who's watched YouTube knows that the Illuminati are understood to be a truly extraordinary organization. that has achieved the goals of its historical rival, right? The Holy Alliance that was begun in the 1814, which was actually the international cooperation of kings to try and consolidate like global power. So how the fuck did that happen? How did that story get turned around? And what's that about? There's multiple answers there. There's like a lot of things that happened. Why was that story turned around? Okay, it's partly because, you know, from the very beginning at the French Revolution, there was a whole propaganda thing about the Freemasons being under the control of the Illuminati, right? Although at that point it was the government saying it, not the people about the government. So it kind of starts there. But then you have, at the beginning of the 20th century, you have a whole anti-Semitic propaganda campaign that kind of links the Jews with the Freemasons, and then that kind of, it's a way of like criminalizing the Jews, and so that takes on a whole life of its own. And then you have, you know, right now, at this particular moment, you've got a revival of these ideas that proliferate at like amazing speeds. And you could say, oh, it's because of the technology, it's because of the internet, it's because of YouTube, or because of the algorithm on YouTube. But maybe that's partly true. It partly has to do with the way information travels on the internet. But maybe it's also has to do, who's putting these videos on the internet? What's going on? And here I'm going to sound a bit like a conspiracy theorist myself, maybe. But you know, when I watched these first YouTube videos in 2006, when I first like went down the rabbit hole, I noticed, you know, I saw what there was. And then I see that in 10 years later, they are different, you know. They're something happened. Like the first ones, like all the 9/11 documentaries, you know, they were largely, I mean, there's outliers, you know, but a lot of them, mostly, they were about oil men and governments fucking over the little people. Now it's about a globalist conspiracy against America. Like, it's and I don't know, is that just because people are stupid and they make stupid things, and there's these stupid guys who are conspiracy theorists who aren't educated and they sit in their mother's basements, and like this whole stereotype of who's a conspiracy theorist and how they're white working class idiots who like, you know, don't understand things and are ruining the world. And I'm like, what? The first conspiracy theorist I met was like a Mexican Zapatista Solidarity activist guy, so it doesn't really work for me. And I think it's important to think about, like, rather than just writing it off, especially since at this point writing it off, like, it doesn't, you know, maybe 10 years ago you could be like, oh, I'll just ignore those conspiracy theorists, but like right now, there's like, for every anarchist, there's like, you know, 1 million people that thinks the world's run by the Illuminati. So I feel like it's important to figure out how to engage with this fucking problem somehow. My book is just one, I mean, it's not, I'm going to do it, right? It's one book. I'd like to think I can do it, but it's not going to do it. So how are we going to engage these things? And one of the things I feel like we can and should do, just in a general way, to engage this is to sort of, you know, rather than call people stupid or engage them as the enemy, you know, throw them out of the collective, we kind of honor the fact that there is some valid social commentary in these theories. Like, they're getting at something. There's a reason why they're interesting to people. They're not all wrong. So, like, I have a quote here. I don't want to read this. Yeah. Some of my readers may already be aware. A significant fraction of the videos currently found on YouTube that critics commonly discuss as conspiracy theory tell stories of the Knights Templar finding secret treasure under Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem during the Crusades, with Illuminati-controlled Freemasons later using it to collapse the great world traditions into one big banking tradition in the name of Lucifer. Okay, so the scholarly, you know, social scientists are always going to prefer things like systemic forces to like the whimsy of a few powerful knights and Freemasons, not to mention the Rothschilds. And that's fine. But it shouldn't take too much to notice that, like, this narrative and, like, the one by, you know, Karl Polanyi in The Great Transformation, like, they're more different in form than in content. And as such, it should be possible to go to someone who thinks this about the world and maybe bring them over to a kind of anti-capitalist politics as opposed to a fascist one. And so I think that's important to do. And you know, even the lizards thing kind of makes sense, you know, you could grant, in the sense that there's a long cultural tradition of referring to the blue-blooded aristocracy. Right? These things are allegorical in a way. And if you see them, maybe it's because I'm an anthropologist, but if you see these things as allegories, it's possible to, like, you know, get past your initial, like, what the fuck, and be like, oh, okay, these people are upset about the world. They think the world is so fucked up that it's literally run by evil and the devil. That's someone who really hates banks. Maybe we could work with this, you know? Yeah, and I mean, I think I'm going to end there, except that I want to say one thing about the art of memory, which is something that's a whole thread running through the book, which I'll just say something brief about. There's a classical art of memory, which, the classical art of memory, I won't explain the whole thing now, but it was taken up by Renaissance magicians, okay? It's an art of like how to make people remember things, how to impress things upon the memory, and how to, you know. And this whole bunch of knowledge was also then taken up by Freud, right, in his theory of psychoanalysis, which is informed by Renaissance magician theories of memory. And then Freud's theories of psychoanalysis are like taken up by like advertising PR guys, you know, Edward Bernays, his son-in-law, and the whole story there. And so in some ways, like, Renaissance magic is being used to mind control us, just not in the way that conspiracy theorists might otherwise suggest, right? Both conspiracy theorists, like amateur documentary makers on YouTube, and like CNN and mainstream media guys are using these techniques to affect our minds, like when they're showing us these images. And it would be good to learn about how this works and what this history is, and just get a handle on what's going on, because now as then the Hermetica like proves adaptable to a variety of projects, whether it's pyramid schemes or leveling schemes or pyramid schemes for leveling, as above so below. I'll end it there. Yeah.